Page 11. Chapter 1, Theory before, quote, Theory, unquote, Liberal Humanism. The History of English Studies. Para. It is difficult to understand liberal humanism, bracket, that is, the traditional approach to English studies, see the introduction, page 3, bracket closed, without knowing something about how English developed as an academic subject. So this is the topic of the next few pages. Para. Stop and think. The multiple choice questions below indicate the scope of what is touched upon in this section. Underline what you think are the right answers before reading further, and then correct your answers if necessary as you read on. 1. When do you think English was first taught as a degree subject in England? Was it 1428, 1528, 1628, 1728, 1828 or 1928? 2. At which institution was English first taught as a degree subject in England? Was it Oxford University, Cambridge University, London University, Southampton University, or none of these? 3. Until the 19th century you had to be a member of the Anglican bracket Episcopalian bracket closed church and male to take a degree in England. True or false? 4. Until the 19th century lecturers on degree courses in England had to be unmarried Church of England clergy. True or false? Page 12. 5. Until the 19th century, women were not allowed to take degrees in England. True or false? 6. In the early 20th century, women could take degree courses in England, but were not allowed to receive degrees. True or false? Page 12 continues, para. To explain the rise of English studies, we need to indicate briefly what higher education was like in England until the first quarter of the 19th century. The short answer is that it was a Church of England monopoly. There were only two universities, Oxford and Cambridge. These were divided into small individual colleges which were run like monastic institutions. Only men could attend them, of course, and students had to be Anglican communicants and attend the college chapel. The teachers were ordained ministers who had to be unmarried so that they could live in the college. The subjects available were the classics, bracket, ancient Greek and Latin literature, bracket closed, divinity, bracket, which was taken by those seeking ordination, bracket closed, and mathematics. Anyone who was Catholic, Jewish or Methodist or atheist was barred from entry and hence, in effect, barred from the professions and the civil service. As far as higher education was concerned, then you could say that right up to the 1820s, the organization of higher education had not changed since the Middle Ages. Para. Many attempts were made to reform the situation, expand higher education, and introduce practical subjects into the curriculum, but they all came up against entrenched conservative forces. The breakthrough came in 1826 when a university college was founded in London with a charter to award degrees to men and women of all religions or none. From 1828, English was offered as a subject for study, and they appointed the first English professor of English in 1829. However, it was not really English as we know it. It was mainly the study of English language, merely using literature as a source of linguistic examples. English literature as such was first taught at King's College London, bracket, another college of what later became London University, bracket closed, beginning in 1831. Para. In 1840, F. D. Maurice, M.A.U.R.I.C.E., was appointed professor at King's. He introduced the study of set books, and his inaugural lecture lays down some of the principles of liberal humanism. The study of English literature would serve, quote, to emancipate us, page 13, from the notions and habits which are peculiar to our own age, unquote, connecting us instead with, quote, what is fixed and enduring, unquote, full stop. Morris regarded literature as the peculiar property of the middle class and the expression of their values. For him, the middle class represents the essence of Englishness, the aristocracy are part of an international elite, and the poor need to give all their attention to ensuring mere survival, so middle class education should be peculiarly English and therefore should center on English literature. Morris was well aware of the political dimension of all this. People so educated would feel that they belonged to England and that they had a country. Quote, political agitators, unquote, may ask what this can mean, quote, when his neighbor rides in a carriage and he walks on foot, unquote, but, quote, he will feel his nationality to be a reality, in spite of what they say, unquote, stop. In short, learning English will give people a stake in maintaining the political status quo without any redistribution of wealth. Para. You can see from this that the study of English literature is being seen as a kind of substitute for religion. It was well known that attendance at church below middle class level was very patchy. The worry was that the lower classes would feel that they had no stake in the country, and having no religion to teach them morality and restraint, they would rebel and something like the French Revolution would take place. The Chartist, Chartist agitation of the 1830s was thought to be the start of this, and the first English courses are put in place at exactly the same time. Para. The conventional reading of the origins of the subject of English is that this kind of thinking begins with Matthew Arnold in the 1850s and reaches its height with the publication of the Newbolt Report on the teaching of English in England in 1921. It is evident from material like Morris's inaugural lecture that this was happening much earlier. However, I do not accept the simplistic view that the founders of English were motivated merely by a desire for ideological control. This was undoubtedly one of their motives, but the reality was much more complicated. There was behind the teaching of early English a distinctly Victorian mixture of class guilt about social inequalities, a genuine desire to improve things for everybody, a kind of missionary zeal to spread culture and enlightenment, and a self-interested desire to maintain social stability. Page 14. Para. London University degrees were taught by external license at university colleges in major industrial cities. Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester, Sheffield, Leeds, and so on. All these places eventually becoming major universities in their own right. Hence, the spread of the subject at degree level throughout the country. However, Oxford and Cambridge were suspicious of the new subject of English and held out against it, Oxford until 1894 and Cambridge until 1911. Para. In the last quarter of the 19th century, there was vigorous discussion and campaigning to establish a chair in English at Oxford. In 1887, the first attempt was defeated largely because of a speech in the convocation by the professor of history, Edward Freeman. Freeman's speech is another key document. It touches upon several problems in English which are still unresolved. He said, quote, "We are told that the study of literature cultivates the taste educates the sympathies and enlarges the mind, unquote, stop. These are all excellent things, only we cannot examine tests and sympathies, stop. Examiners must have technical and positive information to examine, unquote. Para. This is a problem which has never been entirely solved in English. What exactly is its knowledge component? As a way of attaching specific and technical information to the study of English, early supporters had advocated the systematic study of language, but early advocates of English wanted to separate literature and language study so that the one could be done without the other. Freeman's famous response was, quote, "What is meant by distinguishing literature from language? If by literature is meant the study of great books, and not mere chatter about Shelley, ? Unquote. Para. Freeman won the argument. Literature had to be studied along with language, otherwise it would not be an academic subject at all. So when the English course was finally set up at Oxford in 1894, it contained a very heavy element of historical language study, Anglo-Saxon, Gothic, Letto, Elititio-Slavonic, Middle English, etc., from which it has still not managed to free itself entirely. Para. A greater sense of direction was given to English in the Cambridge English School in the 1920s. Because Cambridge English was the most recently founded, dating only from 1911, it had the least weight of tradition to fight against, so change was relatively easy. The engineers of this change were a group of people who began teaching at Cambridge in the 1920s, page 15. They were I. A. Richards, William Empson, and F. R. Lewis. Para. I. A. Richards was the founder of a method of studying English which is still the norm today. Firstly, it made a decisive break between language and literature. Richards pioneered the technique called practical criticism, the title of his 1929 book, stop. This made a close study of literature possible by isolating the text from history and context. Instead of having to study, say, the Renaissance period as a distinct historical moment with its characteristic outlook, social formations, and so on, students could learn the techniques of practical criticism and simply analyze the words on the page. The gain from this was that it was no longer possible to offer a vague, flowery, metaphorical effusion and call it criticism. Richards argued that there should be much more close attention to the precise details of the text. Para. A second Cambridge pioneer was a pupil of Richards, William Empson, E-M-P-S-O-N, who presented his tutor with the manuscript of the book, which was published in 1930 with the title 7 Types of Ambiguity. This book took the Richards method of close verbal analysis to what many felt to be an extreme. Empson identified 7 different types of verbal difficulty in poetry, which is what he meant by ambiguity, and gave examples of them with worked analysis. Another Cambridge critic, F. R. Lewis, said in a review that it is a highly disturbing book because it uses intelligence on poetry as seriously as if it were mathematics. Not everybody liked this ultra-close form of reading. T.S. Eliot called it the lemon squeezer school of criticism, and his own critical writing is always on a much more generalized level. Para. The last of these Cambridge pioneers was Alfred Levis, Levis, probably the most influential figure in 20th century British criticism. In 1929, he met and married Q. D. Roth, R-O-T-H, subsequently known as Q. D. Levis. He had written his doctoral thesis on the relationship between journalism and literature. She had written hers on popular fiction. These were revolutionary topics, and a certain excitement and glamour attached to this couple in the 1930s. In 1932, they founded an important journal called Scrutiny and produced it together for 21 years. As the title implies, it extended the quote, close-reading, unquote, method beyond poetry to novels and other material. Page 16 para. Levis's faults as a critic are that his close readings often turn out to contain lengthy quotations on which there is surprisingly little comment. The assumption is that the competent reader will see there what Levis sees. As has been said of him, he often gives the impression that he is analyzing the text when he is really just paraphrasing it. Secondly, his approach to literature is overwhelmingly moral. Its purpose is to teach us about life, to transmit human values. His critical terms are never properly defined. He famously refused the invitation offered by the critic René Wellek, R-E-N-E-W-E-L-L-E-K, in the 1930s that he should, quote, spell out the principles on which he operated in a more explicit way than hitherto, stop, unquote. The result was one more degree of isolation for literary studies. In the period of its growth just surveyed, it claimed independence from language studies, from historical considerations, and from philosophical questions. The consensus which held the subject together from the 1930s to the 1960s rested upon the acceptance of these demarcations. The, quote, project, unquote, of, quote, theory, unquote, from the 1960s onwards is in a sense to re-establish connections between literary study and these three academic fields from which it had so resolutely separated itself. Section 10 Tenets of Liberal Humanism. Para. The personal account on pages 8 to 10 mainly responds to the second and third of the four questions given earlier. I am now going to expand on the implications of the fourth question, which asked what it is exactly that we learn when we do English in the traditional way. Of course, we learn things about specific books and authors, but I mean here the more general values and attitudes which we absorb from English and which remains as a kind of distilled essence of the subject when all these specific details have been forgotten. These are not usually formulated and stated, but they are in a sense all the more real for that being simultaneously both pervasive and invisible. They can only be brought to the surface by a conscious effort of will of the kind we are now trying to make. So what follows is a list of some of the elements which we seem to constitute this, quote, distilled essence, unquote, of the subject, comma, that is the corpus of attitudes, comma, assumptions, comma, and ideas which we pick up, comma, probably unawares, comma, as we do it. These seem to have been what we were learning when we studied English, page 17 dash. These are the values and beliefs which form the subject's half-hidden curriculum. 1. The first thing naturally is an attitude to literature itself. Good literature is of timeless significance. It somehow transcends the limitations and peculiarities of the age it was written in and thereby speaks to what is constant in human nature. Such writing is, quote, not for an age, comma, but for all time, unquote, bracket, as Ben Jonson said of Shakespeare, bracket closed, colon, it is, quote, news which stays news, unquote, bracket, Ezra Pound's definition of literature, bracket closed. 2. The second point is the logical consequence of the first. The literary text contains its own meaning within itself. It doesn't require any elaborate process of placing it within a context, whether this be A, sociopolitical - the context of a particular social background or political situation, B, literary historical - whereby the work could be seen as the product of the literary influences of other writers, or as shaped by the conventions of particular genre, or C, autobiographical - that is, as determined by the personal details of the author's life and thought. Para. Of course, as scholars, most academics would assert the value of studying these contexts, but as critics, their adherence to the approach which insists upon the primacy and self-sufficiency of the words on the page commits them to the process which has been called, quote, on-site close reading, unquote, stop. Essentially, this removes the text from all these contexts and presents it, quote, unseen, unquote, for unaided explication by the trained mind. Stop. 3. To understand the text well, it must be detached from these contexts and studied in isolation. What is needed is the close verbal analysis of the text without prior ideological assumptions, comma, or political preconditions, comma, or, comma, indeed, comma, specific expectations of any kind, comma, since all these are likely to interfere fatally with what the 19th century critic Matthew Arnold said was the true business of criticism, comma, quote, to see the object as in itself it really is, unquote, stop. Number 4, human nature is essentially unchanging. The same passions, emotions, and even situations are seen again and again throughout human history. Page 18. It follows that continuity in literature is more important and significant than innovations. Thus, a well-known 18th century definition of poetry maintains that it is, quote, what oft was thought, but never any apostrophe er so well expressed, stop, unquote. Likewise, Samuel Johnson famously denigrated Sterne's Sterne' novel Tristram Shandy on the grounds of its novelty, that is, its originality. 5. Individuality is something securely possessed within each of us as our unique essence. This transcends our environmental influences, and though individuality can change and develop, as do characters in novels, it can't be transformed. Hence, our uneasiness with those scenes, bracket, quite common, for instance, in Dickens, unquote, which involve a, quote, change of heart, unquote, in a character, so that the whole personality is shifted into a new dimension by force of circumstance, the miser is transformed and changes his ways, or the good man or woman becomes corrupted by wealth. Such scenes imply a malleability in the essence of character, which is at odds with this underlying assumption of English studies. The discipline as a whole believed in what is now called the transcendent subject, which is the belief that the individual, bracket, the subject, bracket closed, is antecedent to or transcends the forces of society, experience, and language. 6. The purpose of literature is essentially the enhancement of life and the propagation of human values, but not in a programmatic way. If literature and criticism become overtly and directly political, they necessarily tend towards propaganda. And as Keats said, quote, "We distrust literature which has a palpable design upon us," unquote, that is, literature which too obviously wants to convert us or influence our views. 7. Form and content in literature must be fused in an organic way so that the one grows inevitably from the other. Literary form should not be like a decoration which is applied externally to a completed structure. Imagery, for instance, or any other poetic form which is detachable from the substance of the work in this way rather than being integrated with it, is merely, quote, "fanciful," unquote, and not truly imaginative, bracket, the distinction made by Coleridge in the Biographia Literature, bracket closed, stop. 8. This point about organic form applies above all to, quote, "sincerity," unquote, stop. Sincerity, bracket, comprising truth -to -experience, honesty towards the self, page 19, and the capacity for human empathy and compassion, bracket closed, is a quality which resides within the language of literature. It isn't a fact or an intention behind the work which could be gleaned by comparing, say, a poet's view of an event with other more factual versions, or from discovering independent external information about an author's history or conduct. Rather, sincerity is to be discovered within the text in such matters as the avoidance of cliché or of overinflated forms of expression. It shows in the use of first-hand individualistic description, in the understated expression of feeling, whereby, bracket preferably, bracket closed, the emotion is allowed to emerge implicitly from the presentation of an event. Moreover, when the language achieves these qualities, then the truly sincere poet can transcend the sense of distance between language and material, and can make the language seem to enact what it depicts, thus apparently abolishing the necessary distance between words and things. 9. Again, the next idea follows from the previous one. What is valued in literature is the silent showing and demonstrating of something rather than the explaining or saying of it. Hence, ideas as such are worthless in literature until given the concrete embodiment of enactment. Thus, several of the explicit comments and formulations often cited in literary history contain specific denigrations of ideas as such and have a distinct anti-intellectual flavor to them. Here we see the elevation of the characteristic, quote, ing, lit, unquote, idea of tactile enactment, of sensuous immediacy, of the concrete representation of thought, and so on. According to this idea, bracket, which is of course itself an idea in spite of the fact that the idea in question is a professed distrust of ideas, bracket closed, words should mime or demonstrate or act out or sound out what they signify, rather than just representing it in an abstract way. This idea is stated with special fervency in the work of F.R. Lewis, bracket, for a critic of the enactment idea, see, quote, The Enactment Fallacy, unquote, by the present author in Essays in Criticism, July 1980. For a general discussion, see James Gribble's, GRIBBLE', Literary Education, Cologne, a Re-Evaluation, Cambridge University Press, 1983, Chapter 2, bracket closed. 10. The job of criticism is to interpret the text, mediate between it and the reader. A theoretical account of the nature of reading, page 20, or of literature in general isn't useful in criticism and will simply, if attempted, encumber critics with preconceived ideas which will get between them and the text. Perhaps in this phrase, quote, preconceived ideas, unquote, we get another glimpse into the nature of this pervasive distrust of ideas within liberal humanism, for there seems to be the notion that somehow all ideas are preconceived in the sense that they will come between the reader and text if given half a chance. There is in fact the clear mark here of what is called English empiricism, which can be defined as a determination to trust only what is made evident to the senses or experienced directly. Ultimately, this attitude goes back at least to the philosophy of John Locke, 1632 to 1704, which gives a philosophical expression to it. His book, Essay Concerning Human Understanding, 1690, puts forward the view that ideas are formed when direct sense impressions from the world are imprinted on the mind. The mind then assembles these, so giving rise to the process of thinking. Locke rejected introspective speculation as a source of valid knowledge and insisted on the need for direct experience and evidence of things. Traditional English studies, we might say, has always been Lockean, L-O-C-K-E-A-N, in this sense. Para. The above list contains a series of propositions which I think many traditional critics would on the whole subscribe to if they were in the habit of making their assumptions explicit. To gather ideas like this and the literary practice which went with them are now often referred to as, quote, liberal humanism.